The Fox News studios in Manhattan were configured for maximum visual impact as they prepared for what Sean Hannity had been promoting as one of the most important interviews of the political season. The set featured the familiar arrangement of Hannity, seated behind his desk, with a guest chair positioned at an angle that allowed the host to lean forward and project intensity during confrontational exchanges. The lighting was calibrated to create the stark atmosphere that characterized Hannity's primetime programming, designed to convey seriousness and urgency about the political topics under discussion. Multiple cameras were positioned to capture every expression and gesture from both participants, with the control room prepared to cut between angles to maximize dramatic effect. Sean Hannity himself sat reviewing notes and checking his phone while makeup artists made final adjustments, his expression suggesting confidence about the interview he was about to conduct. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas, the 43-year-old Democratic Congresswoman, whose rise to national prominence had been driven by her articulate defense of progressive policies and her remarkable ability to remain composed under hostile questioning. Crockett wore a professional burgundy suit and maintained a calm demeanor despite understanding fully that Hannity had not invited her on his program to have a friendly conversation about policy nuances. She had accepted the invitation after careful consideration with her communications team, recognizing that appearing on Fox News presented both risks and opportunities to reach audiences who might not otherwise encounter Democratic perspectives presented directly rather than filtered through conservative commentary. What neither Hannity nor his production team anticipated was that this interview would not follow the usual pattern where the Fox News host controlled the narrative through aggressive questioning and selective framing. Instead, within the next hour, Crockett would deliver a response so perfectly calibrated and so devastating in its precision that it would literally freeze the studio as producers, crew members, and even Hannity himself struggled to process what had just occurred. The moment would become one of the most analyzed political interviews in recent memory, studied for both its immediate dramatic impact and its broader implications for how political discourse functions in contemporary media environments. Before we proceed with the complete examination of this remarkable confrontation and analysis of why Crockett's response proved so effective at dismantling Hannity's attack, we encourage you to subscribe to this channel and activate notifications to ensure you receive our ongoing coverage of significant political developments and communication strategies. Please share your perspective in the comments regarding whether mainstream media outlets provide fair coverage of progressive politicians or whether systematic bias shapes how their positions are presented to audiences. We now turn to the detailed account of what transpired during this interview and why it became a watershed moment in political communication. Sean Hannity had constructed his career over 3 decades as one of the most influential conservative media figures in America. His radio program reached millions of listeners daily, while his Fox News television show consistently ranked among the highest-rated programs in cable news. Hannity had built his audience by positioning himself as a defender of conservative values and a fierce critic of liberal policies and Democratic politicians. His interviewing style with political opponents was confrontational and designed to put guests on the defensive through rapid-fire questioning, interruptions when responses threatened to undermine his framing, and deployment of talking points that resonated with his conservative audience, regardless of their factual accuracy. Hannity understood instinctively that his viewers tuned in not to hear balanced discussions of policy trade-offs, but to watch him challenge Democrats and validate conservative perspectives on current events. His close relationship with Donald Trump and prominent Republicans gave him access and influence that extended well beyond traditional journalism into direct political impact. Democratic politicians who appeared on his program faced a challenging environment where the host, the audience, and the network's editorial perspective all operated from the presumption that conservative positions were correct and liberal alternatives were misguided at best and dangerous at worst. Jasmine Crockett represented Texas's 30th congressional district and had quickly established herself as one of the most effective communicators among the new generation of progressive Democrats elected in recent cycles. Her background practicing civil rights law for 15 years before entering politics had equipped her with skills that translated remarkably well to political communication. She possessed comprehensive knowledge of policy details, experience with adversarial questioning from her legal career, and an ability to remain composed under pressure that served her well during contentious congressional hearings and media appearances. Crockett had become known for her powerful speeches on the House floor addressing issues of racial justice, economic inequality, and democratic accountability. Her social media presence was substantial, with millions of followers who appreciated her willingness to articulate progressive positions clearly and defend them forcefully when challenged. Conservative media had increasingly targeted her as she gained prominence, recognizing that she represented an effective spokesperson for political perspectives they opposed. Fox News in particular had featured critical segments about her positions on criminal justice reform, healthcare policy, and economic regulation, typically presenting her views through hostile framing, designed to make them appear extreme or unrealistic. The decision to accept Hannity's interview invitation had required careful strategic consideration by Crockett and her team. The potential downsides were obvious, including the hostile environment, the likelihood of misleading editing if the interview went poorly, and the risk that appearing on the program would be interpreted as legitimizing a media outlet that regularly promoted misinformation. However, the potential benefits were also significant. Fox News reached millions of viewers, including some persuadable independents and moderate Republicans who might respond positively to hearing progressive arguments presented directly and competently, rather than through the distorted versions typically offered by conservative commentators. An effective performance could expand Crockett's national profile beyond her existing progressive base and demonstrate to other Democratic politicians that it was possible to appear on conservative media without being destroyed. Perhaps most importantly, the interview would be recorded and clipped, with segments circulating on social media where they could reach audiences far beyond Fox News's regular viewership. Crockett had confidence in her ability to handle Hannity based on her legal training and her previous experience with hostile media environments. She prepared thoroughly by reviewing Hannity's previous interviews with Democratic politicians, identifying his common tactics and attack lines, and developing clear responses to predictable questions that would satisfy both accuracy and accessibility requirements. The interview began in characteristically confrontational fashion, as Hannity opened by acknowledging Crockett's presence, but immediately framing her as representing the radical progressive wing of the Democratic Party. He noted for his audience that she supported Medicare for all, which he characterized as government takeover of healthcare that would destroy the private insurance industry. He mentioned her advocacy for criminal justice reform, which he framed as wanting to release criminals and defund police departments. He referenced her support for higher taxes on wealthy individuals and corporations, which he described as socialist policies that would destroy economic growth and drive successful people out of the country. This opening monologue served to establish for his audience that Crockett represented dangerous policies that threatened American prosperity and security. Crockett sat listening calmly to this characterization, recognizing it as standard Fox News framing of progressive positions. She understood that responding defensively to the labels would be counterproductive, and that she needed to redirect the conversation towards substantive policy discussion, using language that could resonate even with conservative viewers. Hannity's first direct question concerned crime rates in Democratic-controlled cities, an issue that Fox News covered extensively and that Hannity frequently used to attack progressive prosecutors and criminal justice reform advocates. He cited statistics about violent crime in several major cities and demanded that Crockett explain why she continued supporting policies that he asserted were making communities less safe. Before Crockett could respond with more than a few words, Hannity interrupted to provide additional examples of crimes that had occurred in cities with progressive prosecutors, clearly attempting to associate these specific incidents with Crockett's policy positions. This interruption pattern continued through several attempted responses, with Hannity cutting her off whenever she began providing context or challenging his framing. Crockett remained patient through these interruptions, recognizing that showing frustration would play into the narrative that progressive politicians could not handle tough questioning. She waited for opportunities to insert corrections and context, noting that national crime data was more complicated than selective city-level examples suggested, and that many factors influenced crime rates beyond prosecution policies. The questioning then shifted to healthcare policy, where Hannity deployed one of his standard attacks against Medicare for all. He asserted that Crockett wanted to eliminate private health insurance that millions of Americans were satisfied with and force everyone into a government-run system that would lead to rationing, long wait times, and reduced quality of care. He cited the Department of Defense's estimate that Medicare for all would cost $32 trillion over 10 years and demanded to know how Crockett proposed to pay for this massive expansion of government spending. The framing was designed to make the policy sound simultaneously unaffordable and undesirable, appealing to conservative viewers' skepticism about government programs and their concerns about tax increases. Crockett began explaining that the $32 trillion figure actually represented total national health expenditures under a Medicare for all system, and that current projections showed the United States would spend more than that under the existing system of private insurance, making Medicare for all actually cost-saving rather than cost-increasing. Hannity interrupted before she could complete this explanation, insisting that she was trying to confuse the issue and that everyone knew government healthcare meant higher costs and worse outcomes. As the interview progressed, the confrontational intensity increased steadily. Hannity questioned Crockett about her support for climate change legislation, characterizing environmental regulations as job-killing policies that would destroy American manufacturing and energy production while having no meaningful impact on global temperatures. He challenged her views on education policy, suggesting that her opposition to school choice initiatives demonstrated that Democrats cared more about protecting teachers' unions than improving outcomes for students. He attacked her position on immigration, claiming that she supported open borders that would flood the country with illegal immigrants and criminals. Each line of questioning involved the same pattern of hostile framing, limited opportunity for complete responses, and interruptions whenever Crockett began undermining his narrative. The studio audience, composed primarily of Fox News employees and conservatives invited to attend the taping, reacted supportively to Hannity's attacks with applause and expressions of agreement, creating an atmosphere that reinforced the sense that Crockett was defending unpopular positions against legitimate criticism. Throughout these exchanges, Crockett maintained remarkable composure and continued attempting to provide substantive responses despite the hostile environment. She corrected factual inaccuracies in Hannity's questions, provided context that challenged his framing, and explained progressive policy positions in accessible language that avoided political jargon. She remained respectful toward Hannity, even as she firmly pushed back against mischaracterizations of her views. Her legal training was evident in her systematic approach to addressing each argument and her refusal to be intimidated by aggressive questioning. However, the format made it extremely difficult for her to communicate effectively because Hannity controlled the conversation flow and could interrupt whenever her responses threatened to undermine the narrative he was constructing for his audience. Political observers watching the interview live recognized that Crockett was performing competently under difficult circumstances, but that Hannity was succeeding in preventing her from making sustained arguments that might resonate with his viewers. The turning point came approximately 40 minutes into the scheduled hour-long interview, when Hannity shifted to what he clearly considered his most devastating line of attack. He noted that Crockett frequently criticized wealthy individuals and corporations for not paying their fair share in taxes, and accused her of promoting class warfare through divisive rhetoric about economic inequality. He then revealed what he presented as a bombshell piece of information designed to expose Crockett as a hypocrite. Hannity stated that his team had reviewed Crockett's financial disclosure forms and discovered that she had investments in index funds that included stocks of major corporations. He held up papers as visual evidence and declared that Crockett was criticizing corporate America and advocating for higher corporate taxes, while personally profiting from ownership of corporate stock. He demanded that she explain this hypocrisy to his audience and asked whether she planned to divest from these investments if she truly believed that corporations were exploiting workers and evading taxes. The implication was clear. Crockett was a wealthy hypocrite who attacked the rich while benefiting from the capitalist system she claimed to oppose. The studio fell silent as everyone waited for Crockett's response to this accusation. Hannity leaned back in his chair with an expression of satisfaction, clearly believing he had landed a devastating blow that would put Crockett on the defensive and validate his characterization of progressive politicians as hypocrites. The control room prepared to capture what they anticipated would be a fumbling defensive response that could be featured in promotional clips. Conservative viewers watching at home likely expected Crockett to become flustered or attempt to explain away the apparent contradiction between her rhetoric and her personal financial situation. Democratic viewers who had been frustrated by Hannity's constant interruptions and hostile framing throughout the interview braced for what seemed like a difficult moment for Crockett. The pause extended for several seconds as Crockett looked at Hannity with an expression that mixed patience with something that resembled pity for someone who had badly miscalculated. Then, Jasmine Crockett delivered the response that would instantly become one of the most viral political moments of the year and would fundamentally change the trajectory of the interview. She spoke in a calm, measured tone that contrasted dramatically with Hannity's aggressive energy throughout the preceding 40 minutes. She said that yes, she did have retirement savings invested in diversified index funds as recommended by financial advisors for long-term financial security, and that these funds included stocks of many companies as part of broad market exposure. She noted that this was entirely appropriate and consistent with congressional ethics rules. Then she paused briefly for emphasis before delivering the line that would freeze the studio. She stated that Sean Hannity's net worth was estimated at $250 million, that he earned approximately $40 million per year, and that his compensation was paid by Fox Corporation, a major media conglomerate that paid an effective federal tax rate of approximately 0% due to extensive use of tax deductions and legal avoidance strategies. She observed that Hannity had spent the last hour attacking her for supporting policies that would require wealthy individuals and profitable corporations to pay higher taxes, while he personally benefited more than virtually anyone in America from the current tax system that allowed extremely wealthy people to accumulate massive fortunes while contributing far less in taxes as a percentage of their income than middle-class workers paid on their wages. The impact of this response was immediate and profound. The studio went completely silent as producers and crew members processed what had just occurred. Hannity's face registered genuine shock as he appeared not to have anticipated that Crockett would directly confront his personal financial situation. The studio audience that had been applauding his attacks moments earlier sat frozen, unsure how to react to this reversal. The control room personnel could be heard through Hannity's earpiece, attempting to provide guidance about how to respond, but their voices created confusion rather than clarity. For perhaps the first time in his decades-long broadcasting career, Sean Hannity appeared genuinely at a loss for words. The silence extended for approximately 8 seconds, an eternity in live television, before Hannity finally began attempting to respond. His initial reaction was to claim that his personal finances were not relevant to the discussion and that Crockett was deflecting from questions about her own investments and policy positions. However, this response immediately sounded hollow, given that he had been the one to introduce personal financial information into the conversation by highlighting Crockett's index fund investments. Crockett calmly pointed out that Hannity had made this topic relevant by questioning whether her personal investments created hypocrisy regarding her policy positions, and that if personal financial situations were fair game for examining consistency between private behavior and public advocacy, then his situation was at least as relevant as hers. She noted that she was advocating for policies that would require her to pay higher taxes on any investment gains, while he was defending a system that allowed him to accumulate generational wealth while paying lower effective tax rates than many of his viewers. The logical force of this argument was undeniable, and Hannity's inability to articulate a coherent response became increasingly apparent as he stumbled through several false starts. Hannity attempted to pivot by arguing that he had earned his wealth through hard work and providing value to audiences, and that he should not be punished through confiscatory taxation for his success. This was a standard conservative talking point about taxation, but in this context it served only to reinforce Crockett's point about whose interests he was actually defending. Crockett responded that nobody was proposing to confiscate anyone's wealth, but that asking extremely wealthy individuals to contribute a larger share of their substantial income to fund public goods that benefited everyone, including the infrastructure and educated workforce that made their success possible, was not punishment, but rather reasonable reciprocal obligation in a democratic society. She noted that Hannity's $40 million annual income exceeded what an average American worker would earn over 800 years, and that progressive taxation proposals would still leave him with more annual income than 99.9% of Americans would see in their entire lifetimes. She asked him directly whether he genuinely believed that paying a few $1,000,000 more in taxes would represent unfair punishment given his extraordinary financial position. The question hung in the air as Hannity visibly struggled with how to respond. Any answer he gave would create problems for his position. If he acknowledged that higher taxes would not actually harm him materially, he would undermine his broader argument against progressive taxation. If he insisted that requiring him to pay more would be unfair or harmful, he would sound disconnected from the economic reality faced by his working-class viewers. If he tried to pivot back to attacking Crockett, he would appear to be evading a direct question after having demanded direct answers from her throughout the interview. The control room could be heard providing increasingly frantic guidance through his earpiece, but none of the suggestions seemed to offer a clean way out of the corner into which he had painted himself. Hannity eventually attempted to argue that the issue was not his personal situation but rather the broader principle that high taxes discouraged investment and economic growth. But this response came across as evasive and disconnected from the specific question Crockett had posed. Crockett pressed her advantage by noting that the economic evidence did not support the claim that higher marginal tax rates on extremely high incomes discouraged growth. She cited the economic expansion during the 1,950 seconds and 1,960 seconds when top marginal rates exceeded 90%, and the comparison with European countries that maintained higher tax rates while achieving comparable or superior outcomes on economic growth, healthcare, education, and quality of life metrics. She suggested that the real issue was not economic efficiency but rather political power, specifically the ability of extremely wealthy individuals and corporations to shape tax policy through campaign contributions and lobbying in ways that protected their financial interests regardless of broader societal impact. She noted that Hannity and Fox News consistently advocated for policies that benefited their corporate owners and wealthy executives, while using cultural issues and resentment politics to maintain support among working-class viewers, who did not actually benefit from these economic policies. This observation cut to the core of the business model underlying conservative media and the political coalition that sustained it. The studio remained largely silent as this exchange unfolded, with none of the applause or vocal support that had greeted Hannity's earlier attacks on Crockett. The shift in energy was palpable and visible in the body language of everyone present. Hannity, who had begun the interview leaning forward with aggressive confidence, now sat back in his chair, appearing defensive and uncertain. Crockett, who had endured 40 minutes of hostile interruptions and mischaracterizations, now projected complete command of the conversation. The reversal was so complete and so visually obvious that even viewers who agreed with Hannity's politics could see that he had lost control of the interview. The producers faced a dilemma about whether to cut to commercial break to give Hannity time to regroup, but doing so would make the situation even more obvious and would generate additional attention when clips of the exchange inevitably circulated online. Hannity made one final attempt to regain control by suggesting that they should return to discussing Crockett's policy positions rather than dwelling on personal financial situations. Crockett agreed readily, but noted that this was precisely what she had been attempting to do throughout the interview before Hannity had chosen to make personal finances relevant by attacking her index fund investments. She offered to answer any substantive policy questions he wished to pose, but she added that if he intended to continue using personal attacks and mischaracterizations rather than engaging with actual policy arguments, she would be prepared to continue highlighting the disconnect between his personal financial interests and the positions he advocated on his program. The implicit threat was clear. If Hannity reverted to his confrontational approach, Crockett would continue exposing the self-interested nature of his policy advocacy. Hannity had no good options. Continuing the aggressive approach would invite more devastating responses. Shifting to a more substantive discussion would represent an implicit acknowledgement that his previous approach had failed. The interview had moved beyond his control. The remaining 15 minutes of the scheduled program proceeded with notably different energy than the first 40 minutes. Hannity asked questions about various policy issues, but his tone was less aggressive and his interruptions less frequent. Crockett provided detailed responses explaining progressive positions on healthcare, climate change, economic regulation, and other topics. And for the first time in the interview, she was largely allowed to complete her thoughts without being talked over. The studio audience remained subdued, no longer providing the supportive reactions that had reinforced Hannity's earlier attacks. The control room's guidance through Hannity's earpiece became less frequent as producers apparently recognized that the best strategy was to let the interview conclude without creating additional problems. When the program finally ended and Hannity thanked Crockett for appearing, the conventional pleasantries could not disguise the reality that this interview had not gone remotely as he had intended. The aftermath of the interview saw immediate and extraordinary reaction across social media platforms and political media outlets. Clips of Crockett's response about Hannity's personal wealth and the subsequent exchange began circulating within minutes of occurring live on air. The video spread with remarkable velocity as users across the political spectrum recognized they were witnessing a rare moment of genuine confrontation that had not followed the expected script. Progressive activists celebrated the exchange as a triumph of truth-telling and as validation of their criticism of conservative media hypocrisy. They created hashtags related to the moment and shared the clips extensively with commentary about how Crockett had exposed the self-interested nature of Fox News's policy advocacy. Political moderates and independents who watched the exchange, even those who might not have agreed with all of Crockett's policy positions, generally acknowledged that she had handled Hannity effectively and had made legitimate points about the disconnect between his personal financial situation and his political advocacy. The response from conservative audiences was more divided and defensive, with some acknowledging that Hannity had walked into a trap, while others insisted that Crockett's response had been inappropriate personal attack rather than substantive policy debate. Mainstream political journalism provided extensive coverage of the interview with generally favorable assessment of Crockett's performance. Major newspapers published articles analyzing the exchange and discussing its implications for how progressive politicians should engage with conservative media. Cable news networks ran segments featuring the most dramatic clips, along with commentary from political strategists and media critics. The consensus among professional observers was that Crockett had demonstrated exceptional skill in turning a hostile interview environment to her advantage, and that her willingness to directly confront Hannity's personal financial interests had exposed tensions that conservative media typically avoided acknowledging. Several commentators noted that the interview revealed the challenge facing conservative media figures who had built audiences through populist rhetoric while personally benefiting enormously from the economic status quo they defended through their political advocacy. The impact on both participants proved significant in different ways. For Jasmine Crockett, the interview dramatically expanded her national profile and reinforced her reputation as an exceptionally skilled political communicator. Her congressional office reported overwhelming positive constituent feedback. Her fundraising received substantial boost from small donors, inspired by her performance. Progressive organizations immediately sought to feature her more prominently in their advocacy efforts. The interview became part of her political brand and was referenced regularly as evidence of her ability to compete effectively in any media environment. For Sean Hannity, the aftermath was considerably less positive. While his loyal audience continued supporting him, the interview generated significant criticism, even from some conservative commentators who viewed it as an unforced error. The clips showing him frozen and unable to respond effectively to Crockett's observations about his personal wealth circulated far beyond his usual audience and created awareness of the exchange among people who would never normally watch his program. His subsequent attempts to reframe the interview or minimize its significance received limited traction given the widely available video evidence of what had actually occurred. The interview became a watershed moment in discussions about how progressive politicians should engage with conservative media outlets. Democratic communication strategists studied Crockett's approach and identified replicable techniques, including thorough preparation, maintaining composure under hostile questioning, waiting for strategic moments to counterattack rather than remaining constantly defensive, and willingness to directly challenge the personal interests underlying conservative policy advocacy. These lessons influenced how other Democratic politicians prepared for appearances on Fox News and similar outlets. The exchange also sparked broader conversations about the role of personal financial interests in shaping political media coverage, and whether journalists and commentators had obligations to disclose how their policy advocacy aligned with their personal economic situations. The lasting significance of the confrontation between Sean Hannity and Jasmine Crockett involves what it revealed about power dynamics in contemporary political communication. Traditional assumptions held that conservative media hosts maintained decisive advantages when interviewing progressive politicians due to their control over interview format, their supportive audiences, and their ability to frame discussions through selective questioning and editing. Crockett's performance demonstrated that these advantages were not insurmountable and that well-prepared politicians who understood the dynamics could effectively counter hostile interviews through strategic communication that resonated with broader audiences beyond the immediate conservative viewership. The interview showed that direct confrontation of the personal interests underlying political advocacy could be more effective than purely defensive responses to policy attacks. These insights continue influencing how political communication training prepares candidates and elected officials for media appearances across ideological divides. We appreciate your attention throughout this comprehensive examination of a defining moment in contemporary political media. Please subscribe to our channel to receive ongoing analysis of significant political developments and communication strategies that shape public discourse. Your engagement through comments contributes to broader dialogue about media practices and effective political communication. We encourage you to share this analysis with networks who would benefit from understanding how preparation and strategic thinking enable politicians to succeed even in hostile media environments, and why such examples matter for evaluating the quality and integrity of political journalism in democratic societies.